Thank you for joining us for the final session of this year's NewsLitCamp. I hope you enjoyed a day filled with great speakers and amazing presentations. This discussion centers on news media bias. As you know, a very polarizing and controversial topic. I believe this discussion can tie together today's theme of strengthening relationships, growing understanding, and building trust in the institutions that support our democracy. I'm DeMario Phipps-Smith, Senior Manager of Community Learning at NLP. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce a few housekeeping rules. First, the session is being recorded, and we will send it out to you via email following this session. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A feature located on the bottom left of the screen to ask and post questions. We'll open the floor for questions following the initial conversation between myself and today's esteemed guest, Tom Rosenstiel. Tom Rosenstiel is a nationally renowned journalist, author, political pundit, and the Eleanor Merrill Scholar on the future of journalism at the University of Maryland. Tom is recognized as one of the world's innovative minds on the topics of journalism, media, and technology. Before joining the University of Maryland, he helped reinvent the American Press Institute into a leading learning organization on modern news and media. Tom is also the author of 11 books, including 4 novels, and he currently teaches classes on the role of journalism in democracy, news delivery models, media innovation, and the intersection of media and politics. We are very lucky to have you join us today, Tom. Welcome to the program. How are you feeling today?
I'm good. Thanks, DeMario. I appreciate it. Very generous introduction.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to jump straight into the questions because we have a lot of things to get into today. And I do want to allow time for people to ask questions following our conversation. So as I just mentioned, you're a renowned author. Your book, The Elements of Journalism, is for people who don't know, one of the most important texts in the field of journalism. Almost everyone who is trained as a journalist has dealt with it in some capacity. And one of the elements that you outline in the book is the idea that journalism should provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. Can you explain what that means in detail, the role that it plays in our democracy, and whether you think this is something that is happening currently today?
Yeah. There's a very famous journalism scholar named Jim Carrey who once said that at its essence, journalism is conversation among citizens. And he wrote this decades ago. What he really meant is that the purpose of journalism, its function, is to provide information so that the public can have an opinion and form opinions and come to come to help create a consensus that political leaders will merge around. That's one of the things that distinguishes journalism, say, from advocacy. Advocates are trying to persuade people to adopt a particular position. Journalists are there to inform people so that they can make up their own minds. Journalism emerged in the early 17th century to basically, as part of the Enlightenment, to allow information that was once held in court by the few to be held by the many. And it was after the printing press that the term public opinion even started to emerge. And so the notion that there's a public, that the public knows things about public affairs and has an opinion on them, and that's relevant to governing, is an essential part of democracy. Okay, to your second part of your question, we say that forum should be civil and should help provide a basis for compromise. That's baked into the notion of American democracy. It's if you read Federalist 10, written by James Madison, that's what it's all about, right? How can factions that disagree come to a place where they can agree and so that you can govern? And in the current environment, when technology and the algorithms that technology uses really kind of exaggerate our differences, it's even more important for journalism to model a civil discourse, a civil discussion. And when I say that the algorithms magnify our differences, that's baked into the economy of the platforms, because they make their money from targeted advertising. And targeted advertising means advertising that knows the difference between you versus me, even if we're sitting in the same classroom next to each other, students in the same university. You're going to see different ads than I'm going to see. That's how they make their money. It's the architecture of the internet, of the commercial internet, is built around our differences. It's an architecture of differences, which is really different than how journalism works, which is an architecture around similarities.
Awesome, man. And really, thank you for breaking that down. I wasn't expecting you to go into the algorithms of that, but that's a big thing in news literacy right now, is understanding the algorithms behind some of these social media companies. So thank you so much for that. Moving right along, in your more recent book, The New Ethics of Journalism, you talk about the challenges for journalists in maintaining independence and ethical standards in an era when consolidated media ownership and increased financial pressures pose potential influences on reporting. What are those challenges, and how can journalists better demonstrate their independence and adherence to ethical standards and guidelines?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you think about our national media ecosystem and the economics of national media, the highest rated show on cable news is about 3 million people. And most shows, even in prime time for cable, have less than that. Well, 3 million people, that's 2% of American adults. So that's really a targeted media. It's not mass media. One way, a very reliable way to get 2% of American adults to watch you is to be really partisan, is to play to people's aggressions, to play to people's grievances. It's what I call a journalism of affirmation. You come there to be affirmed, not to be challenged, and to be reassured. Well, the economics of national media really encourage that, and that's true of Fox, it's true of CNN, it's true of MSNBC. And when they look at their numbers, we know this from the Fox Dominion lawsuit. If they start to challenge their audience after you've built an audience that's built around affirmation, once you start to tell them things that are inconvenient, you may lose and antagonize that audience. And so there's a lot of reinforcement to continue to reaffirm. The economics of local media are still pretty different. Think of it this way: Fox owns local TV stations, but to do well economically, they need 30, 40, 50% of the market. That's what they're aiming for, 30% of the market share. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're playing an ideological game. You're just going to antagonize too many people. You're not going to have enough viewers. So the same company plays a different game, and employs a different strategy when it does local news. And, newspapers are struggling, obviously, we all know that. And people are getting their, a lot of news from social platforms. And unfortunately, the platforms are not very oriented towards local information. And once again, as I said before, they're because they're really sort of global and national, they fall more in the side of providing information that supports people's preconceptions.
Okay, and you mentioned something I had a thought on. Recently, I saw studies that Trust in national media is almost at an all-time low, but trust in local media is pretty encouraging. So are there things that local media have been doing historically or recently that have stood out to help them be more successful in garnering public trust?
I think some of it is kind of just structural, right? I mean, people who disagree with each other politically root for the same football team. We all drive on the same roads. We suffer from the same weather. This is not to say that local issues can't be polarizing. School board issues look pretty polarizing these days. And it's possible, I think, that even things like weather may end up being polarizing if we divide over climate change and things like that. But there's still common ground. And the data would suggest that there's actually still a public square, a shared public square there within local media. Look, if the hurricane hits, it hits us all. And, even if we've divided, and this is one thing that's happened, we've divided geographically by neighborhoods. So, if you live in Dallas and you're conservative, you tend to live in one neighborhood or one suburb. And if you're a liberal, you'll tend to live in another one. But the hurricane doesn't care about that. The rainstorm doesn't care about that. The power shortage doesn't care about that. So we're unified there. And that's something that local media, as it shrinks and is under pressure economically, that's an opportunity for them to kind of rebuild.
I love what you said about newspaper and journalism being like the public square or the place for the public forum. That makes me think of op-ed letters and letters to the editors, or what's today like newsletters, right? And that's a very important part to the connection that journalism has to community. So I love that point that you made. Also, I think another great question is, in both books, you talk about the ethical dilemmas that journalists face while doing their work, which, as we know, is always changing. And one of those dilemmas today is whether or how journalists should engage with the public, especially on social media. What guidance would you have regarding this front?
Yeah, well, so this is really an open debate. I mean, social media showed up, about 15 years ago or a little less. And we all created policies that said, don't say things in social media that will cause people to, lose trust in the organization. Don't say anything on social media that you wouldn't say, on the air if you're in TV or radio or, in print if you work for a newspaper. But people now, 15 years later, there are people who grew up with social media. They've been living out loud, as it were, and they have come into newsrooms and say, wait a second, I can't be one person at home and another person at work. You can't deny me my views. And so there's a real tension now in the profession over this. In fact, Marty Baron, was the editor of the Washington Post, has just written a memoir in which, at the end of his very successful tenure at the Post, he began to have a rebellion because he was coming down hard on people who would say things in social media that would cause people to criticize the newspaper. Specifically, what Marty was upset about is, we're covering this issue. We've selected the people who we want to cover this issue. We've taken great care in how we've written these stories and what the headlines that we've written, and avoiding adjectives and inflammatory language. And then someone else on the staff feels, I want to weigh in on this, and I'm going to use whatever language I want. I'm not edited. I'm just speaking as myself. But everyone knows you still work for the newspaper, so they will use that tweet or that Instagram post to say, see, I knew these guys were biased. And Marty even says, I cannot imagine when he was at the Boston Globe, and they were doing the story about the Catholic Church scandal that later became famous in the movie Spotlight. He said there was no social media back then. But he can only imagine if after they were doing these stories and the church was livid and wanted to criticize the Globe, what if somebody on the staff had said, you know what, I want to bring up this whole thing of celibacy, like how ridiculous that is, or anything else that might have given the people, given the church, a reason to try and attack their coverage. So there's a real tension here. And I teach this in one of my classes, and I've got students who say, look, I'm gay. I'm not going to be neutral about political people who say that I should be denied my civil rights as a gay person. Like, this is too personal for me. I can't separate this from my journalism. So it's really unresolved. But I think that most people, it's a balancing act. How can you let journalists, be themselves and maintain the trust of a news organization they work for? I honestly think that we don't know where we come out on this. There are differences. There are generational differences. The more I teach it, the more people go, okay, well, maybe you do need to restrict what people can say in the same way that you restrict journalists. Almost every news organization says, journalists, if you work here, you can't make political contributions. You can't have, you can't endorse candidates. You don't sign petitions. You don't put signs out in front of your house. There are restrictions or limitations. And I think that where we will end up is there are limitations, but there are carve-outs for everybody around issues that are so personal and that relate to identity that we'll give you a pass on that. But don't do things that will bring criticism down on the organization. But honestly, the industry hasn't found a balance point yet.
Yeah, I hear that. I think that's what a struggle was when I was working in newsrooms. You saw that change from place to place. Like you said, there's generational differences with a lot of new digital media now. They might have different policies. They're more legacy news organizations. And I think that we've seen that. But I think what you started on about this conversation around bias is a great entry point to my next question. A lot of people believe that bias in news is very intentional and overt, that it is very clear cut when it happens, and that that's clear and on purpose. But the reality is that most serious newsrooms, most journalists are trying to be accurate and fair and to avoid bias. But what do you think accounts for this disconnect between what the public believes and what newsrooms are trying to accomplish?
Yeah. I think there's two things, and I've been involved in researching this in some interesting ways. So one reason that goes way back, when everybody who's ever been a journalist knows this, is that people perceive that there's more sort of organizational strategy within a newsroom than there really is, right? They think that somebody up at the top is saying, hey, write this story this way, and let's push this agenda or that agenda. And the reality is that news moves so quickly that it's much more chaotic. There's no strategy. There's like, Al, something just happened, go out there and find out what it is. And Al comes back and writes a story, and that it's patched onto the website today even faster than it once would have been in print or on television. TV news back 20 years ago, didn't come on until about 4:00 in the afternoon, or maybe 5:00 in the afternoon. And now, you've got instantaneous. So there's just not a lot of coherent strategy. There's less editing. And that's one element. People infer more conspiracy and intention to creation of news than exists. But the other, I think, more subtle factor is that journalism, it has inside it a kind of ideology. And what I mean by that is journalists believe that the way you make society better is by spotlighting its problems, and that we should give voice to the voiceless, and that people in power will do bad things if they are not watched. And there's a number of kind of basic tenets that are almost part of the mindset of journalism. Which is why we believe in transparency. We're very fact-oriented. These are professional norms, but added together, they represent a kind of ideology about society. And what we did when I was at API is we we took an approach based on research on moral instincts, there was this concept that there are 5 core moral instincts that people have, which are attitudes about loyalty, attitudes about authority, attitudes towards fairness, and attitudes towards care for others, and attitudes towards sort of purity, how pure and kind of diluted versus purity that people have. And everybody's kind of on a scale on these 5 instincts. Well, if you take these journalistic norms and you put them on a scale and ask people their attitudes about them, what you see is that most people they're not in sync with these journalistic norms. They think that a lot of bad news, may make things worse. That sticking your nose into what authorities are trying to do may undermine those authorities. And journalists will say, well, I did this expose on abuses in the national security community, and people say, wait, you're giving away our national security secrets. So part of this notion of bias, I think, is I see a consistent pattern in you journalists in the kind of stuff you do, and it bothers me. I don't agree with it instinctively. And journalists that's, I think, why journalists say, no, I'm just doing my job.
Right.
And not really articulating it. People think, that's not how that's not your job. So I think there's a kind of almost an unconscious tension here between norms that journalists think are universal and universally understood and accepted, and the reality that they're not.
Wow. Well, that's great, because I think a big theme of today is connection and connecting journalists with everyday people. And a lot of times, I think we heard a stat today that a large portion of the demographic has never met a journalist before, and hasn't met a journalist. So those type of things, if we're able to build connections and build relationships, hopefully we can begin to repair the trust that's been lost.
Well, and let me add one thing to that, an interesting insight about people have never met a journalist. So we talked about how on cable TV, there's a real partisan model. Most of the journalists that people have seen are people that they've seen on cable, many of whom aren't really journalists at all. They're spokespeople, they're advocates, they're analysts, but they're not actually reporters going out and doing stuff. They're on a panel talking, and people think, well, that's journalism, and most journalists think, oh, that ain't what I do.
Absolutely. I think that the hard part about the infotainment side is it's entertaining, but it's not really how journalism is done. It's just a large part of it is entertainment. But that goes into also, I think that's another great leeway into my next question about the cynicism that people have about media, especially in regards to media ownership. People believe that corporate parent companies or major advertisers have a hand in shaping reporting and coverage, but most journalists who work in legitimate standards-based newsrooms, they take their independence very seriously. So what advice would you give to help folks think about the issues of media consolidation and ownership in a more productive way?
Yeah. Right. I mean, the interesting thing is that back in the days when media made a lot of money, and by the way, when I got into the business in the 1980s, media made a lot of money. TV stations expected profit margins of over 40%, and newspapers 25 plus. And grocery stores operate on 2 to 3% margins. So media was very, very profitable. It no longer is profitable, but back then, the basic model was, we have so many advertisers that no one advertiser can push us around. And I certainly went through this experience where you would write something and you would antagonize the car dealers or the furniture retailers or some group or some particular company, and they'd say, we're pulling our ads, and the publisher of the newspaper or the TV station general manager would say, go ahead, fine, you'll be back. Because there were it was just there weren't that many media outlets that you could use to reach a large part of the audience. That's changed, and you will see now there is more advertiser influence in local TV. The margins are tighter. There's a lot of sponsored content. If you watch morning television shows and you see these little features about this company or that company, there's a very good chance that those things are actually paid. And it may or may not be clearly transparent. This is a growing problem. Journalists still believe in their independence. In fact, they're probably even more fiercely independent because they can see the water lapping up, higher on the shore. One interesting thing about this is that as we move away, the economics of journalism are now shifting towards subscriptions.
Yep.
The New York Times used to make 25% of its revenue from subscriptions and 75% from ads. Well, those numbers are now entirely reversed. The New York Times, which used to have a million subscribers, now has 10 million subscribers. 10 million, and they're mostly digital only, and they make 75% of their money from those subscriptions. So the loyalty and the relationship has really shifted to the reader. What has value for you? What serves you? What helps you? And at the New York Times, which is a brand that people are probably pretty familiar with and many may subscribe to, that loyalty includes the spelling bee, the crossword puzzle, New York Times cooking. I can't live without The Athletic, which they now own. Boy, I wouldn't buy anything if I couldn't, check it out on Wirecutter. Those are all things inside the brand of the New York Times that make me trust, that serve me and help me live my life, and that along with the journalism. And so actually, in many ways, for those publications that are really kind of built around the journalism, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and many new startups, it's really a tightly knit relationship with readers or members or donors. But we also have a lot of newspapers that are shrinking, that are owned by hedge funds, that are extracting money, extracting profits, cannibalizing the papers they own. There was a big company called Alden that owns more than 100 newspapers now. And although the paper's revenues are shrinking year to year, Alden's profit margins are increasing. How is that possible? Because they're cutting staff, they're cutting everything, and extracting what little revenue is left. It's a pretty tragic and dire situation. Now, the newspaper in Boston, which is locally owned, doesn't have that problem. The newspaper in Dallas, locally owned, doesn't have that problem. So the ownership structure really has become a very big issue, bigger issue than it's ever been.
Wow, that's a great point. And I really want to kind of key in on that a little bit as far as the revenue structures. I've been doing a lot of research on non-for-profit models for newsrooms now, with the Chicago Sun-Times being one of the more recent examples of this. What are your thoughts about some of the unique opportunities that journalism might have in the non-for-profit space versus some of the challenges?
Yeah. So it's a great question because there's a lot of movement that way. I'll stipulate to a couple of things. One is, first, I don't think that nonprofit is necessarily superior to a commercial, and the New York Times is a commercial entity. The Washington Post is a commercial entity. There are startups like the Outlook in Santa Cruz, California, which is a commercial, but you wouldn't know it. It looks like a lot like the Minneapolis Star-Tribune is commercially owned. Its owner says, whatever revenue you make, you keep, and that's your budget. They're not extracting profits. Well, that's essentially operating like a nonprofit. The Philadelphia Inquirer, on the other hand, is owned by a nonprofit foundation, but the rules of the road in Philadelphia are exactly the same as they are for the commercially owned. So I think Minneapolis Star-Tribune. So I think the key question, first off, is what are the values of the owner? Are they this hedge fund extracting profits, or are they the billionaire, in Washington or Boston? The second reason that the values of the owner are really important is they're the people who decide you're going to be the editor, you're going to be the CEO, and if you pick an editor who's got a lot of integrity, then the publication's going to have more integrity.
Mhm.
The risks of the nonprofit model, Mario, are how many donors do you have? How diversified is your revenue? If you're
Right.
relying on one donor or three donors, then those donors who are often engaged in charitable donations around advocacy and different areas, and they're trying to make the world better, and they've got to really believe in journalistic independence. They've got to really think, okay, if you want to say bad things about us, go ahead. We get it. That's part of the price that you have to. In Marty Baron's memoir, he talks about how Bezos had to really be educated. Like, we're going to kick you in the shins, and you're just going to have to take it. And he came to understand the mission. But when he bought the thing in the first place, it wasn't his world. And
Mhm.
I think you're seeing that this is an issue as the nonprofit sector matures, of educating donors that you've given the money, but you've got to allow for more independence than you might have recognized or that you're used to.
Awesome. Well, that's a huge point. I think independence in the non-for-profit model is definitely like a pretty big concern, but if they figure it out, it could be a really great relationship. The next question, I guess I want to go back into this topic of bias. How can people recognize when their initial perceptions of bias, whether in a particular piece or in an entire newsroom, are well founded? Like, how can we think about and know when to speak out about the things that we might feel are biased?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a complicated issue, and it's made more complicated by the fact that you have leaders in one of the political parties using, kind of repeating this mantra that the press cannot be trusted, that the press has a bias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, journalism is a human endeavor. It's a creative endeavor, and it's produced by people who are perceiving events, writing them, framing them, telling stories about them. So there is subjectivity involved in that process. What do I think is news? Is this newsworthy or not newsworthy? That's not an entirely objective or scientific decision. And one of the things that you see is it's not so much the way a story is put together, but if you look at the difference between, say, Fox and MSNBC, it's the choice of story in the first place. What do they think is newsworthy, or how do they frame the story? If the story is, how bad will this be for Biden? There's a presumption in the way the story is built. Or if this is, is this the end for Trump? That story framing is where the bias is, not in how the reporter then goes out and interviews people and asks them questions, things like that. The other element to this is that you have so within that creative room, you've got a group mentality that can kick in, a kind of default culture, which can be itself a kind of bias. Who is it that you choose to write the story? Is this a story? Is this a person who really has a cold eye and doesn't bring a lot of subjectivity to it? Is this person somebody who is older? Are they younger? I mean, did that? If you send a white Jewish person to cover a Black Baptist church, you're going to get, they're going to come with some lack of background than if you sent the daughter of a Black Baptist preacher who grew up in that milieu to cover the same story. So there's subtlety there. And I think really that one of the things that I teach in my classes is objectivity. There's three definitions of objectivity, if you think about it. There's the dictionary definition, which is like, you have no opinions, no insights, no biases, nothing. You're a cipher, which is an abstract ideal, but an impossibility. Then there's the scientific or social science definition of objectivity, which is about process. I use a particular method, and I choose this, and I do random testing, and I do blind, the way you would do medical research, or ethnography, anthropology, all the methods that you bring to try and be as accurate as you can. And that what I would call objectivity of method. And then there's this other form of objectivity, which is objectivity of presentation or style that journalists used to adopt. Use a neutral voice, never use the first person pronoun, pretend you're an omniscient narrator. I think that's increasingly out of fashion. People realize it's kind of a pose, and it's bogus, and a lot of biased journalism can be produced using that voice and that style of presentation. So I think that I think hopefully and helpfully that's going away. So what good journalists aspire to and understand, even if they haven't really articulated, is what they have in mind is this objectivity of process. Have I gone about this in a way that I can share with you? And if you look at it, you say, yeah, that seems pretty good. And more we're moving towards that. Journalists have become way more transparent. You'll read a story in the paper, it'll say this story is based on interviews with 25 people, and we did this, we did that, and the other thing. This is journalists realizing, oh, okay, I'm not neutral, but I can show my process. And in that form of objectivity, that objectivity process, it actually begins by identifying the biases I bring to the process, not by denying that they exist at all. Like I would say, hey, let's you and I work on this story together because I'm an old white guy and you're not an old white guy. So let's do it together. And we might actually see things working together. And that's the other thing. Journalism used to be pretty much a lone wolf thing. You'd have one byline per story. Yep. Now you see a story, moving fast, got a lot of people working on it, and you see these bylines, and then a credit line at the bottom. It's like 7 people worked on this thing. Okay, yep. That's good. 7 people is smarter, are smarter, be smarter, whatever, than 1.
That's awesome. No, that is entirely true. I would say this on objectivity. By the time I started in journalism school, it was taught one way, and by the time I graduated, and 3 years later, it was taught completely different way. So it's a very nuanced subject. It's very complicated, and I think people from different demographics feel differently about it. So I Absolutely. Totally hear that.
Right. I mean, the other thing, and we talked about default culture. When old newsrooms, they thought, well, we're objective. What that meant is we're old white guys. And if you weren't that, you'd say, I don't think you're so objective. I mean, every person of color I've ever met in a newsroom, every woman I've ever met in a newsroom thought, what the hell? This is just your culture, but it's not objective.
Great point. And so let's talk more about the ways that people can discern how something might be biased. If they happen to come across something they're not sure, what are some ways that you might center a conversation around bias, or some questions to think about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I would go and look, and if I were a teacher, I would ask my students to do this too. I mean, if I were not a journalism teacher, but if I were just a teacher of regular, normal students, I would say, well, who do they talk to? Who are the people? Who are the sources that they're citing in this story? Are they all the same? Do they all have the same point of view? Do they all come from a certain slice of the culture? That's one. Another is, what's the evidence here? There's levels of evidence. There's, in courtrooms, we're kind of familiar with this. Are you an eyewitness, or are you an expert, or is this hearsay, just something that somebody said to you? The closer you are to actual evidence, like I saw the video, I was in the room, I read the transcript, it's a document, that's more solid. There's also something to, is it a physical fact, or is it a more interior fact? By that, I mean, like, what was said in the meeting is a physical fact. How many people were in the room is a physical fact. Was the table round or square? That's a physical fact. Why did the president say that thing is an interior fact. It's about motivation, and you can't know that as well. actually need more evidence. The further you get away from a physical fact, what did he say? And more into what was the motivation behind that? What was the strategy? What were these people thinking?
Yeah.
You actually need more proof, not less, even though it's easier to just use hearsay. Think of the complicated voting that happened in the House of Representatives this week, right? You needed 217 people to vote for a guy that 217 people do not agree with. So there were some people who voted for this guy who don't agree with him on a lot of things. And why did they do that? Well, we can have one person kind of lean out the room and whisper to reporters, well, we need to do this, that, and the other thing. But we really don't know all that much about what happened there, because that's a lot of interior facts that were happening. All we know is the guy, they finally found a speaker. What his life going to be like, we don't know.
And as we round up here, I think this is another good question to help people kind of think about bias in a way too. Do you think that there's a difference between bias in news reporting and bias in opinion journalism, and how should news consumers differentiate between the two?
Yeah, another good question. I mean, obviously, an opinion writer is offering his or her opinion, and what we say in the elements of journalism is they still got to play by the same rules. Can't make stuff up. You got to verify your stuff, and your opinion should really be your own. If you're a shill for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, then I can predict what you're going to say every time, and your reasoning's not going to be that great. But if it really is your reasoning, it's going to be more interesting. And sometimes you're going to agree with the faction that you usually agree with, and sometimes you're not. I mean, I've got some very good friends in journalism who are columnists, and it's like, you ought to break with your team sometimes, because it's more interesting when you do, when you're criticizing your own team. Whereas we expect news reporters most of the time to just be telling us what happened and maybe why it happened. Those classic elements: who, what, when, where, how, and why. Now, why is more subjective and how is more subjective, and I need better proof for that. But that's where news people reside, and then columnists can say, and here's what I think about that. Right. But they still have to do the 5 W's and the 1 H.
No, I think that's a great point. And at NLP, we really emphasize the point of, when you're having these conversations, that opinion journalism is inherently biased. It's someone's opinion, like Tom just said. But news, when we're having these conversations of bias and we're really trying to think critically and have productive conversations about them, they need to focus on news reporting. So thank you for underscoring that for us. Before we get into the Q&A questions, I want to kind of ask this question to end on this note. How can news organizations improve on the work that they're doing to mitigate bias and to promote more balanced reporting? And what role do the ethical guidelines and journalistic standards play in improving this effort?
Well, the answer to that is simple and hard to do. The first thing that newsrooms need to do is they need to have more diverse. They need to be more diverse. And that doesn't mean just hiring different kinds of people. It also means letting them be different once they're there. Because journalism has been, claiming that it's been trying to diversify for 40 years. But what happens is they get people of different cultures there, and they think, well, this is not a very hospitable place, and they leave. And it's just a sort of churn rate, because the newsrooms are still permeated by this older culture. So that's one thing that has to change. The second thing, and this part we're probably having more success, is we need to be more transparent about how we do the stuff, how we make the stuff.
Absolutely.
So that you can see it and decide for yourself. And if I can't do that, then you shouldn't trust me. I've done a lot of survey work in my life. One thing you didn't mention is I spent 16 years directing the media research at the Pew Research Center. So I've done a lot of studies. And, one of the ways you can tell whether a survey is on the up and up is, did I release the survey to you? Did I show you the questionnaire? And did I show you the top line? How many people answered every question? have I been as completely transparent? Have I handed over the goods? And
Mhm.
if a survey doesn't do that, you should run for the hills, because it's probably not a trustworthy survey. The same thing, basically, although not as simple, in journalism. If I can't show you how I made the dish, I wouldn't eat it.
Wow, that's awesome. I was just talking to somebody about the need for journalists to educate the public on the process of it, to peel back the curtain behind it and let the public know why it's important to support it with their time, with their effort, with their wallet. Because it's, having information that's credible and trustworthy is a paramount to our democracy. And then speaking to your point about diversity, I will also add that programs like Report for America, who's our partner, are doing amazing jobs connecting journalists of color to newsrooms and helping that diversity problem. So there are things, journalists and journalism aligned people are doing to help remedy some of these problems. So it's not all bad. There are definitely things to help improve things.
I mean, I just to underscore that, if we've been having this conversation 10 years ago, the economics of journalism are more complicated than they were 10 years ago, but there's also more innovation in more newsrooms now than there was 10 years ago.
That's awesome. That's all I have for you. I know I'm gonna get to these questions. I know people have been dying to ask you a few things. So I'm gonna jump right into them. Again, if you can ask questions now if you feel like it. There's the option on the lower left of the screen to ask for the Q&A. And this first question comes from Kate. She asks, what are your thoughts on the potential impact of AI in journalism?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, and like everybody in the world is thinking about it. So, look, a good friend of mine on the faculty of Merrill said, when the internet came along, journalists tried to pretend it wasn't there and hoped it would go away, and that was terrible. They should have run right at it and used it as a tool. The same thing is true of AI. If we think, oh, AI, we can have AI write our stories, they'll be bad stories and it'll be a mess. But if we think, hey, I could use AI to run what I've learned through fact-checking websites to see if somebody said something wrong. I could use AI to synthesize all the interviews I did and see similar patterns among the things that people did. I could use AI. I could use AI to analyze how our newspaper or our publication has covered our communities and identify what's missing. We tend to verify our coverage story by story. We don't ever really look back and say, what have we missed? What have we covered and not covered, and who have we talked to and not talked to? I could use AI to do that, but I have to be proactive about it. I have to actually, write code to use AI for that. And by the way, AI is much larger than ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a subset of AI. So there's a lot of things we can do if we harness AI as a tool to make journalism better. Or we could say, oh God, another technology, maybe I could be retired before it's over. Then it will win, and Hal will take over the spaceship.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And with that, I think it's about learning the jargon or the buzzwords in AI. Like, I think machine learning, if you want to know more about this type of technology that you're speaking about, you might want to specifically look up something like machine learning. And another question around from Kate, she asks, do you see a similarity between journalists and public service providers like teachers and librarians, or more specifically, like how journalists can write, podcast, blog, make opinion pieces? Are journalists perhaps more able to operate in both the citizen journalism and the organizational journalism spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think there's a lot of similarities between teachers and journalists. You're not trying to indoctrinate your student. I hope you're not trying to indoctrinate your students. You're trying to get them to think for themselves, and giving them the tools to do that. That's really what journalists are about, and that's really the line between the journalist and the advocate. I say journalism is a form of activism, but it is not advocacy, because advocacy is I'm trying to persuade you to agree with me or vote for this thing, and journalists are like, here's the information. You decide. Again, I'm reading Marty Baron's memoir. Marty's a friend of mine, and he says, look, our job was to uncover the truth, not to decide who should be elected. That's ultimately the way that it works. Is it's up to the American people to decide. And if they want to ignore these things, there's nothing we can do about that. He's your classic journalist. He's, and he's unequivocal about who's lying and who's not in the book. But he said, it's not our job to try and rig the election. I think there are a lot of similarities. It is a public service. Journalists always felt that way. It was great that, the real estate ads and the car ads and the food coupons, grocery coupons, subsidized what I did, but I didn't work for them. I worked for the public, and journalists have always felt that way. They've always felt this is a mission, this is a service. I do this it's a kind of an act of patriotism. It's a civic act, and I'm glad somebody else is paying for it, and I don't have to worry about that. Now they have to worry about it, and they have to understand their readers better, and their listeners and their viewers, and that's a good thing because it connects us closer to the people we're trying to serve.
Awesome. So I want to end on a good note. I know we've been talking about a really heavy topic here, but with this upcoming election coming up and misinformation being one of the biggest crises of our time, what are some things that people can lean on as far as finding credible information or ways to connect with the election so they can be more informed? What are some things that exist or that you've seen people working on that people could really lean on in this upcoming election?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy here, but, I saw it on the internet is not a good source. I would start with trusted sources. If in my life I'm on social media less than I used to be. The platform formerly known as Twitter, has become less useful in my life. I think Facebook has moved away from news because it's controversial. We know their algorithm serves up less news than it used to. And that may in the end redound to the benefit of journalism. Like your news consumption, your civic knowledge should not be the dining room table at Thanksgiving, because Uncle Oscar can say whatever the heck he wants, and it may or may not be true. And the internet is kind of, if the conversation among people around a table, that table's gotten very large, and there's a lot of people saying a lot of things. And the bigger your Thanksgiving table gets, the more likely it is that there's going to be an argument at it, probably. And the first thing I would say is go to sources that are engaging in this process of verification and can show you how they did it. Don't take people's word for it. Everything on the internet, for the most part, unless you've done a careful search, is hearsay. So it's already in that bad level of evidence. And if you click onto a link, okay, then know what that link is. Is this a place you've ever heard of before? Is it just because it says it's the Oakland Sentinel? Well, what that is the Oakland Sentinel? There is no such thing as the Oakland Sentinel, but somebody can create a fake website and say that there is. So, go to places that that are familiar. And the other element here is, and again, Marty Barron, because I'm reading the book, has talked about this. He said, and we saw this at Pew, there's some percentage of the public that is going to be fact resistant. And they're not going to budge, and they're not going to be resonant to new information. But that's not the majority of Americans. It's probably somewhere between 25 and 30%. So journalism is dealing with the other 70%.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for this amazing conversation, Tom. This has been an amazing time to get to learn from you. I hope everybody in attendance enjoyed this session and enjoyed today's NewsLitCamp. We appreciate you for attending all the sessions. Before you all depart us today, I'm going to ask a small favor. I would love if you all would, hold on as I make this available to everybody. I would love if you all would take our brief survey so that we can bring better news lit camps and improve on our services and programs. Again, as highly appreciated. Thank you all so much for attending. Tom, this was amazing. I appreciate all of your insights, and all of the thanks are pouring in because it was such an amazing conversation. Again, everybody have a great weekend, and thank you for joining us. If you want to know more about any of news lit tips, any of the news literacy tips that was mentioned throughout the day today, because we had so much stuff, you could check us out at newslit.org. And we're on social media, we're on all the platforms. Please connect us with any teachers, educators, friends, anyone in your family or network that might be interested in news literacy. Again, all of our resources are free for the public. And again, thank you all so much for joining us. This was a lovely lit camp. Have a wonderful afternoon and an amazing evening.